All right. So wonderful to be here this morning again. Welcome to What a Word is Worth, a space for creative minds to speak about viable ways to heal the world through writing and other inventive mediums. This is your host, Marianela Medrano. I am the founder of Palabra Training Center, where words are given as medicine. Today, my guest is someone whose scholarship has illuminated my path for so many years, Dr. Maureen Walker. She is a licensed psychologist, speaker, educator, and writer who helps people bridge cultural differences such as race, religion, gender, and other social status markers. Her lifelong mission is to help people live an authentic life, one with purpose, truth, connection, and the courage to create the fullest expression of who they are and who they can be. That is so beautiful. Dr. Maureen Walker's story began with growing up in the racially segregated culture of 1950s and 60s Georgia. She attended racially segregated, under-resourced schools where her mind was tended by women and men for whom teaching was a calling, a sacred duty. She graduated from Mercer University with degrees in vocal performance and English, and she taught for 8 years in the Georgia public schools, where many of the norms of the old segregated or all South segregation persisted. Although her formal role was to teach English literature, giving back meant helping young people of all races as they face the complexities of evolving cultural realities. In 1991, after obtaining her PhD, she moved to New England to become a staff psychologist in the MBA counseling service at Harvard Business School. She served in various roles during her 25 years career at Harvard, always involved helping young professionals from many countries and multiple ethnicities thrive in an academically rigorous and culturally complex environment. Since the early 1990s, she has worked with pioneering scholars as Jen Baker Miller, Janet Sorey, Judith Jordan, and Irene Stiver at the Wesley Center for Women at Wesley College. She is faculty at the International Center for Growth in Connection, formerly known as the Jean Baker Miller Training Institute, and contributed to a model of psychological healing and development known as relational cultural theory, RCT. In addition to offering services through her psychotherapy and clinical supervision practice, Dr. Maureen Walker provides anti-racism training and consultation to government agencies, schools, and businesses. Her book, When Getting Along Is Not Enough, was published by Teachers College Press in 2019. And the book is widely used to stimulate individual reflection and group conversations for book clubs, social justice groups, and faith-affiliated organizations in conjunction with the College of St. Scholastica in Minnesota. She's also involved in developing curricular and certification programs in relational cultural theory. So welcome, Maureen. What a pleasure to have you here.
What a pleasure to be here. I can't think of a better way to start a morning than having a stimulating conversation with a colleague friend.
Yes, and that's exactly what this podcast is all about. I tell people there is no other pretension than just to have good conversations
Yes.
and to dig deep into words and language. So, how has language, I'm going to throw you my first question.
Okay.
How has language helped you bridge cultural differences? And let's stay with the race markers. How do you help people change their narrative? In your book, you address language as codified racism. And you say, let me just read what you said. You said words hurt, particularly when expressed as stereotypes that strip away the right to name the variability and fluidity of one's own expressions or experience. I'm sorry. So tell us, can you expand on this concept of codified racism?
You know, and when you talk about the power of words, as you were asking the question, some of my responses started to change because I started to think. So, if I can go come from two ends of this question, starting with the very beginning. You know, you mentioned how and where I grew up in a racially segregated culture, very, very like the rules of apartheid were in place, and how you presented yourself. You know, you learn to do that through language in certain ways. And my mother, who was a woman who worked as a domestic in the homes of white people at the time, who was educated, I think, not beyond the 6th or 7th grade. She was always very peculiar, very, very particular about words, and how, I spoke about myself, how I spoke to other people. And I remember that she wasn't a real big fan of ma'am and sir. Now which was interesting, because in the South, it's just sort of common language, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, someone who's older. And she said, no, that's the language of servility. If you say yes, that's fine. If you say no, that's fine. Not yeah, not no, but yes and no. So very, very early on, I was sort of guided to use language in a way to say, this is who I am in the world. This is how I stand in the world. And that has just been, it's still a lifelong path. I think what kind of pushed me toward the book was seeing how often people would get twisted trying to talk, or maybe trying not to talk about race. And so it was like, well, what race is this? What race is this? And you check a box. Well, I can check, and it got really, really silly. You also get to see how arbitrary it is, where they were talking about, race as if it was something that was just codified totally on a box, and that's all it meant, an administrative function. So when you see how over the years, throughout the history of the United States, people have sued the government in order to be classified as white, because white is a protected territory. It comes with access to all sorts of resources. So this check in the box thing wasn't right. Then they decided, I tell you what, maybe since there are people who don't want to go either black or white, we can make it easier and put, like, I don't know, 57 boxes for people to check, as if that's somehow supposed to tell what your experience is about. So I think that's really one of the driving impulses that I was following. Like, how do we talk about this? How do we talk about race as a narrative that we live? How do we speak the truth about it? Because we've become so inventive at not speaking the truth about it.
Yeah, and so that's the codified racism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, when we, I think about, you know, I can go through the 70s, the 80s and 90s when there was, you know, there was some, I guess, decision that, yeah, we should talk about race, but let's not really call it that. And so we've been through so many words, and one of my just kind of bugaboo words is like diversity, because it's like, but it's never been about diversity. It's never been about a Sesame Street thing where, you know, oh, if you have green fluff and I have pink polka dots, they're all just the same. It's never been that. It's always been about stratified differences. It's always been about some differences mean that you are entitled to deference, you're entitled to access to resources. Some differences mean that you are not really human, you're subhuman. And so when we look at that continuum that puts like white supremacy on the top, and we see anti-Black racism on the bottom. And by the way, that isn't just phenotype, but in this country, I'll just say anti-Black racism, you see everybody just sort of scrambling to be in somewhere in those little boxes in that continuum. Even if I can't be bright white, as the anthropologist Karen Brodkin used to say, I should do everything to stay away from being Black.
Yeah, I so much appreciate what you're saying, and I love these the way in which you are conceptualizing these. I mean, the whiteness as a protective territory. Where white bodies can amply, so freely be, while Black and brown people and other people of color are constricted, or are expected to be constricted, because I don't think we are.
Yeah. Well, I think a part of I think you're right. And I think a part of what we deal with, though, is having to be intentional about not being constricted, and about paying attention to how we take up space in a place. At what point do our voices become too loud? And someone makes an effort to let us know that. At what point, are we supposed to step aside so that someone else can take up space? That is something that it struck me one day that I think I was getting a car inspected or something. And the person who was inspecting the car was, efficient. I could even say officious, just doing his job, making sure he didn't give anything extra, no welcome or anything. And I remember standing there on a cold January morning, just kind of really, really tight, like muscular constriction. And a young white woman came up and she stopped her car to run into the service station, and she spoke. She was so friendly and she was so free, and she just bounced in and did what she wanted to do and bounced out. And I started to notice, what are the sensations going on in my body? What's happening here? And then I realized, you know what? She's free. And she feels that in her muscles. She didn't stop to think 1 minute about how I will be received. Am I interrupting anyone? There was an expectation that I can go in here and be served. She did absolutely nothing wrong. What I realized is how tight my muscles were. And that's when I tried to become more intentional about, how am I holding my body? Where am I feeling tightness? Are my shoulders up by my ears? Or is there a clench in my throat? Am I feeling something heavy in my chest? And, I think that's one of the things, is we try to move more and more into our humanness. All of us, I think we have to pay much more attention to our bodies.
Absolutely. And what I'm thinking is that there is a code switch that we do, yes. Right? Because when we are among ourselves, we are very free. We are in movement. We are in constant touch and expansiveness, right? Yes. But then when we enter the white territory, we tend to constrict. And I think this is important in terms of, the understanding embodiment and expanding these new, well, not so new, but it's 100 years neuroscience began to point to these things, but embodiment and somatics are so important for us to understand, like as you were saying, to read our bodies, to know how we are code switching, right? And bring consciousness and awareness to that, to how we are, to how we, to use what Tignaham name as interbeing, right?
Interbeing, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that word conscious, because so often we aren't even conscious. I remember my husband walked in one day when I was talking to someone on the telephone, and he said, "Oh, I know you're talking to a Black person." I said, "And how is that?" He says, "Because your whole body is laughing."
and so beautiful.
Until he said that, I didn't realize just how tight I am. And for some of us, most of the spaces that we operate in most of the time are white spaces.
Yes. And that there is, I was talking to a sister, Afro-Caribbean sister yesterday, and she was saying, the exhaustion of identity, some, what is the name of this author? I'm not going to remember right now, but the one who wrote the Black Fatigue book, I can't remember her. It's so bad, but I read.
I know the book. I see the book. I can't remember the name either.
Yes. That's a reality. Right?
Absolutely.
Like it's exhausting to try to reinvent ourselves, to try to always remind people, I'm a human being. I am here. That's exhausting.
That is exhausting. I'm a human being. I'm here and I'm safe. I'm not going to hurt you. I might be worried about getting hurt, but I'm not going to hurt you. And that is a level of fatigue. Like, how much of myself can I bring to this interaction with you, another human being? And if a part of if we're constantly thinking about, okay, how can we show up? What do we have to hold back? I had a client once who said to me, she had been promoted to some higher position in her organization. And when I said, congratulations, she said, yeah, it's more money. And it means, this was a sister from, I think she was originally, she was from Puerto Rico. And she said, yes, but what I have to realize is that I get more money, and I have to remember how much of myself I need to leave locked in the car when I go into the building. And it's what can be, so painful is, God, some of the best parts are locked up in the car. Like, don't come out, because of, if we're dealing in a culture that prioritizes, and we are, white supremacy, that enforces white supremacy, there is an expectation that a part of her job, first and foremost, is to make sure that white people in those white spaces feel comfortable.
Yeah, so there are so many threads I can pull here, but I want to go back to language, right, as a healing tool. So when you look back, your connection with language, I mean, your first, you were majoring in vocalizing and English, like what a combination. What has been, I perceive you as someone who has done a great amount of healing. And not only have you done it for yourself, but you have facilitated healing for so many people. I know that through reading your scholarship, I also began shaping and solidifying my own healing, right? So can you say more about how language and writing and owning your words and vocalizing them have been healing for you?
Well, first, let me say I appreciate that, because we are all on a healing journey together. language is, oh, wow. When we think about how language demeans and how things get named, it starts with noticing. It really, it does start with noticing and helping people to notice. In any space, whether I'm in a classroom or, when I was in a classroom more often than not, whether I'm in a clinical space or just talking to people in just ordinary conversation, it becomes the words we use. I pay a lot of attention to them. I think some of that probably comes from growing up in a way where, it was in order to assert dignity. One of the things that we fought for, and I say we as if I was like on the battle lines. I mean, I'm a kid, but my ancestors fought for was capitalize the N in Negro. It's a proper, if we're going to use the word, whatever it means, it's a proper noun. So capitalize it. It started with little things like that. It also starts with noticing the pride that came when people eventually started saying, oh, African-American, I think first Afro-American, but African-American. What was so important about that is that we grew up on Tarzan. We grew up where, if you see Black bodies, they're swinging from trees in the jungle, half clothed and running away from, I don't know, cameras or whatever, because they were like stupid people. And everybody, like, these are people, I'm in their skin, they're in my skin, we look alike, but oh my God, we've got to do as much as we can to distance ourselves from that. So just the pride really that came with saying, oh, no. This is a cradle of civilization. We sprang from this land. We are on stolen land right now, but there is a land that we came from. Probably can't draw a map to it, but we can claim that. And then more and more into saying things and listening to language. Like in the 80s, you'd hear sentences like minorities will soon be the majority. So it's like, what's a minority? What does that mean? What are you saying when you minoritize someone? Are you saying that they are less than? Are you saying that they don't have as many rights? Well, yes, you are, because that was the truth. But let's not hide it in words like this. Then we got into words again, like I said, diversity. Diverse from what? Because if I'm listening to someone saying, yes, and we have lots of diversity on this campus, and a number of the diverse students, it's like diverse from what? So that implies that there is a standard, and that standard is whiteness, and American is whiteness, and that anyone else who does not, everyone else is measured by that standard, and success is somehow measured as approximating in some ways that standard. So a lot of it is like just listening to language. What are we really saying? And what are we using language to not say? Because we do that. We've gotten really good at that.
It resonates so powerfully with me. And it reminds me when I was doing my graduate degree in counseling, I had a class on, I forget the title, but it was something about multicultural, something this and something that. And I remember being there and wanting to just jump off my skin. I got so infuriated about the way things were described and the way as the teacher attempted to talk about diversity, the more otherized I felt.
Right.
And it was in that moment that I promised myself, I'm going to continue my education and I'm going to go and teach. I didn't end up doing that actually, because then I took the clinical route, which is a way of teaching. But my intention then, at a moment in my life where I had to fight a lot of things. I had a teenage son, and I had no business, being in a doctoral program. But I said, I must do it, because it cannot continue. And if I can do something, I'm gonna do it, right? So I what you're saying is, yes, it's like the intent, and all good attempts, but I think we have to pause and we have to think and we have to understand how language can hurt.
Absolutely.
It can heal, but it can
Mhm.
hurt.
Mhm. Mhm. Hence palabra.
Yes, that's it. That's it. So you also work a lot with relationships and purpose and all these things. And I want to go to RCT, but before we go there, one of the things that you said in your website, you talk about how your journey has been supported by a spiritual, intellectual, and fun-filled partnership with your husband and soulmate, Bill Larkin.
Yes.
What are the core beliefs and practices that have made this relationship a long-lasting one?
Well, interestingly, we met at an anti-racism workshop, and he was the facilitator. He is a white man. Our relationship is such that we can't not talk, and we can't not go into conflict. So part of what I have learned, and I think a part of what keeps everything animated and fun-filled, and not always fun-filled, but mostly fun-filled, but certainly nourishing, always nourishing, is the fact that we have learned to approach conflict in a way that makes us get closer to each other. So for instance, if we are having a conversation of something about race, and maybe he'll say something and I'll go, what? Or I'll say something, he's not, well, what? We have to just go in. We have to go fully in. If we don't, there's a dead zone. And that means we would spend so much time just dancing on the borders of that dead zone, just dancing on the borders of that dead zone. And I said dead zone, what is it that they say? It's not neutral territory, it's never neutral. It's literally dead, don't go there. And so we can't afford to have that, because this is all about bringing, if we want to experience our humanity, and we come to know ourselves, we come to know each other by bringing what the relationship can bear, like bring it into relationship so that we are both learning and growing. So I think that is basically what does it for us. It's like knowing that this is about always learning, always growing, and trusting each other to know that we are safe to learn together.
That is so true. And it's I'm thinking the man I love, and it's a white person as well. And what has tied me to that love is the sense of being seen, of being heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And no one's interpreting your experience for you.
Mm-hmm.
You are trusted to interpret your own experience and reinterpret it, rather than someone imposing meaning.
Yeah. Or wanting you to be different, wanting to, it's that validation, it's that acceptance. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, there are times when I hear people talk about it, and especially younger people who are in interracial or interethnic or intercultural relationships will say things like, it's almost like going in like you and me against the world. It's like, no, dear, you are the world. And the world is in your relationship, and you are in the world. And so it's not you and me against the world. It's how do we learn together as we go through this world? How do we become more fully human together? As we go through this world together. And that is actually quite a gift.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine that our listeners don't know anything about RCT. Can you, help. I was telling you before we started the recording that I can't help but seeing RCT as the backdrop to so many of the movements, the current movements, yet so few people recognize its influence and credit it. I was telling you that just last week I was attending a workshop where it was written all over it. And yet there was no acknowledgement. So I raised my hand and I said, this smells, taste like RCT. And the person was like, RCT? I don't know anything about it. So, I see it in Buddhism as well. So many of the initiatives these days, especially mental health, that are heavily leaning on Buddhism and indigenous wisdom, and no one recognizes that. So just help us so the listeners can identify RCT as the backdrop of many of the things that they are probably learning. So just give us a synopsis of what RCT is.
I'm so glad you mentioned like the ancient wisdoms, the indigenous wisdom, Buddhism, because it's everywhere. One of the experiences that my friend and colleague Judy Jordan had was talking with a group of elders from the Ojibwe tribe, I believe. And she was talking about RCT, and some of the women said, we already know this. And I thought, isn't that lovely? Because we already know this, but we have been trained into this culture of hyper individualism. It's a Western psychology that privileges the experience of people who have certain kinds of power, typically male power, race power, class. Everything in our culture has been about, if you couldn't vote or have a voice unless you were white, male, and owned property. Now, if you were female and white, you could own slaves, but because that was the property that you could own. So if you think about psychology, grows up in this context, Western psychology of hyper-individualism. Now, when Jean Miller and her colleagues were working at McLean Hospital and in their private practices and going, that just doesn't make sense. Because if we pay attention to what Western psychology says, everyone who is not white, male, class privileged, heterosexual is defective. And that's just not true. So it started with conversations among women saying, what are our experiences? And all of the things, for instance, that people thought of as somehow deficient, like having emotions and being attached to other people. The Broverman studies in the 1970s said, oh, yeah, women are kind of unhealthy adults. So Jean's work was all about saying, we've got to reclaim, our space in this. We've got to tell our own story, not have our stories interpreted through these very hierarchical lens, these lens of privilege. And by the way, when we do that, everybody's possibilities will expand. So it started with a group of white, heterosexual, upper middle class women, and the work started to grow from there. Now, all of the psychologists talk about the importance of relationship, but what's so interesting about many of them is that they say, everybody needs really good relationships because then you get grown and you don't need them anymore. You have good self-esteem and you have internal locus of control and you're self-sufficient and autonomy. You have mastery over all these things. It's like, no, what makes relational cultural, that lens different is saying we do need good relationships to grow into healthy human beings. And we need good relationships so that we can keep being better in relationship. Because that's what we are. We are all relationship. Ubuntu, I am because we are. And
Right.
so rather than being this saga of separation and mastery and having control over stuff, control over other people, control over our bodies, control over our emotions, it's about growing with. It's about power with, more than somehow almost rising above the ranks of the rest of humanity. Because if you look at some of the, if you put it in its starkest form, it's basically saying, oh, when you're good and healthy and mature, you're good. You don't really need too much else. And I came into the work thinking, because I was reading a lot of the work from the people who were doing social identity theory, Janet Helms, Bill Cross, and I thought, oh my God, if the premise of relational, it was called self and relation theory at the time. Like, what is a self? Nobody knows. But if the premise is that the primary source of human suffering is disconnection, how do we account for the fact that the culture itself is an agent of disconnection? It's not just something that happens between people, or, you know, somebody was mean in the family or whatever. It's not just about an interpersonal dynamic. It's about an entire culture that is designed to tell you who you are, where you belong, what you have to do to matter, how you can be safe, whom you can trust. The whole culture is designed that way. And the culture, in that sense, is an agent. It can be an agent of connection, but as we currently live in this stratified way, stratified along so many dimensions, the culture is sort of an who's in, who's out culture. And what we're hoping, as we take on this lens of relational cultural work, it's more about how do we grow together into fuller expressions of who we can possibly be as human beings with this planet. Knowing I have a wonderful colleague, we have a wonderful colleague out in Minnesota in Duluth, who says we've got to learn that we are nature. We, you know, it is all relationship.
And that's the interbeing concept, right? That we are all interrelated. The stones, the rain,
Right.
the plants, they're all our relatives. And you know,
Right.
when I read Baker Miller's Toward a New Psychology of Women, that was so illuminating for me as a young person then. And I remember also, you know, being affirmed in what she was saying, but being affirmed in the sense that it was the old wisdom that I was finding there. And the same thing happened to me. You know, my PhD was in transpersonal psychology, which is based on the perennial wisdom. And I remember I was in California, my school was in California, and I will be sitting there listening, and I'm like, this is like my grandpa or my mom talking.
Right.
Like, you know, my mom only has a fifth grade, what is it? She only got to fifth grade elementary school. And yet she knew everything they were teaching me. I was like, she's telling me this. And every time I talk to my mom, she affirms. I mean, she's so wise, right? So I come from people, both my African and Taino roots, for whom communal support has been key to survival.
Absolutely.
And you and the other women behind RCT established, much to my joy and relief, that we heal through connections, that we thrive in connections because we are wired for it, right?
Absolutely.
So the thing, though, despite that knowledge, and despite all the scholarship that is out there, and how it, as I say, is the backdrop of so many of the current approaches, despite that, there is this myth of separation that keeps getting in the way. So we know that common humanity is the bonding factor with everything that is, right?
Mhm.
What do you think is keeping us from fully embodying our common humanity? And I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, but it's a question we've got to keep thinking about that question together.
Mhm.
And one of the things that um, I think about is like, we know, yes, we thrive and survive through communal support. Everyone does. If you have enough power, though, you can hide it. So there is, if you have people, and I'll tell, it's kind of a simple, silly explanation, but when I moved to New England, I passed by a store that was advertising for helpers or something, and they said, "We do mother's hours." And I was going, "What? I've never heard of mother's hours before. What's a mother's hour?" And then of course, it was like it's organized around kids and the school day and all that. And went, "Oh, okay," because so it looks as if women need mother's hours. And why is that? Because the men are getting the support, the women are doing the rest of life. And so it's not as if it's not as if people with power don't have lots of invisible hands propping them up. But the powers functions to keep those hands invisible. And so some part of our getting through this is like bringing it to light. Like, where are all of the invisible hands that are making this quote success, that's whatever, possible. One of the books that was very popular, I don't know if it was the early 2000s or late 90s, but the book Lean In. And it was like, okay, is there any part, and I have to confess, I never read it, but I did wonder, was there any part of that book that talked about all of the invisible support that allows a person to say, just walk into that corporate board and lean in? How many people are taking care of the children, the everything that has to be done, so that you can show up in a boardroom. When you're in the boardroom, no one sees the invisible hand. So there's a part of this, to me, that's about making the invisible visible. The other part is, if we're talking about stratification, we are talking about allocations of power. And people who have more structural power, they get to do the naming. They get to name people and say how other people will be known. So I think that, again, we're back to words. How do we participate in setting up the terms of our relationship? How do we participate in naming our experience rather than having it named for us? And it happens, it's so much a part of our culture, we don't even think about it. I read an article, I guess a couple of weeks ago, by Jill Lepore, the historian Jill Lepore, and it hit me from reading her work. Why wasn't January 6th called a race riot? Change the colors. So we have words that are meant to confuse, words that are meant to deny reality, words that are meant to twist reality. And we're talking now about words as medicine, words to make experience visible, transparent, open, so that we all share and know what we're doing.
And you know what I'm thinking, in homeopathic medicine, the healing is done through using a little bit of poison,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
maybe in language, we have to think in those terms too, is to, part of the work is to identify, how language is hurting, and then begin working from that stance, and twist, not twisting, but reframing
Right.
that
Right.
language.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so okay, so the way we are doing this is we're leaning back on on connection, on the principle
Yes.
of I am because you are,
Yes.
and we are because the Ubuntu principle, which is, again, perennial wisdom, repeated as any perennial thing over and over and over. And we
Yes.
have to constantly remind ourselves.
Yes.
In my culture, I often talk about these practice that I'm sure it was the combination of the African and Taino roots, but there is this practice of juntas where the people in the countryside will come together to work on the parcela, the farm of one particular person. The whole community will come, right, and work with the parcela. And at the end of the day, then they will share crops and whatever shareable things were there. And then the next day they will go to somebody else's farm.
Right.
And that way the work was done without the exchange of money. So that was an agricultural practice that was very sustainable. Now, what happened with industrialization? That was taken away. That's one of the practices that is almost like unknown. If I ask a young Dominican about juntas, they're gonna go like, what? Isn't that what people do when they go to a law firm and they have a junta, right? That will be like the concept they have. So they're going back to the roots, which I think is one of the values of RCT, is that it went back to the wisdom of the great mother, to feminism, right?
Yes.
As a point of support. So if we're gonna do something, if we are going to effect change, it's gonna be by going back, not as a regressive move, but as an affirming one.
Right, right. I think in going back, we also get to discover why it was disappeared in the first place.
Yes.
And whose benefit did that disappearance accrue? There is a theologian whom I love, to quote Walter Brueggemann, but he said once, and I think it was a throwaway comment for him. I was just auditing a lecture that he was doing, but it's lived with me ever since. He'd always say, "Who is telling the story, and whose interest does the telling serve?"
Yes.
So when we look at what gets disappeared, who's served by that? Someone is. And again, who is disappeared by this particular practice, who is demeaned, who is turned into a minority, a less than, someone who's not supposed to expect too much of life.
Yeah, exactly. Tell us a little bit about what you are working on right now, and how your work is evolving.
Oh, wow. Evolving probably gives it a lot more status than it deserves. Let's say I'm in the wilderness. I'm sort of wandering right now. And what I'm drawn to is more and more work around our bodies. The wisdom of our bodies. I'm drawn to some of the ancient wisdoms, like how do we know, what are we on this earth to do? So that's it. And of course, a part of that for me, and how is this, this word race, how does that shape our perspectives, our perceptions, our experience, and how can we keep moving toward whatever it is that is in our, whatever sparks of divinity we might have, whatever we may have that says this is how we become more fully human, by through engaging with each other. I'm trying to see which pieces of that, where basically seeing, where's stuff landing in my body? because I want to do more work, and I want to do something that just lands in my body and says, this is where you go. That is such a vague response, but that's precisely where I am now.
That is, I want to know more because, for the last, I want to say 15, maybe more years, I've been working with embodied writing. Is something that was created by my professor, Rosemary Anderson, and then I just took it more to the creative healing field, and then it has evolved for me it has merged into what I call now mindful writing, but it's all this idea of landing in the body, landing in the roots. At another point, I call it writing from the roots. It has taken many shapes.
Yes.
But tell us more, because what I do within my work is I prescribe palabras as ways for people to root themselves, to yes. first find their roots and go deeper with them, so that we are not so easily uprooted, so that we are not yes. easily swayed by the currents, the hurricanes, and everything that comes our way.
That gets us so confused.
Yes, it gets us so confused. So can you give us examples of how you are practicing embodiment these days? Like, what are some of the practices that bring you into this universe that is Maureen?
Yeah. I guess I pull from everywhere. Mm-hmm. And a lot from music. Uh-huh. I may wake up with a phrase in my head or a tune in my head, and then I start moving with that. And I know it's speaking to something. And one of the things that I will do then is I have bits of paper all over the place that I say, okay, I'm going to put this together. But if words flow out, I put them down. Yeah, I will just, write them. I was in a session recently, and all of a sudden I thought, oh, we've got to figure out how to deal with yeah, but. Because we get so taken off our track sometimes. We are feeling, we're experiencing, we're trying to explore. And someone who is made uncomfortable by that exploration says, yeah, but, and I go, we can't, how do we not get derailed with that? So things like that happen. I'm learning more about being still, because it occurs to me that a part of, when we talk about accepting all of who we are, a part of my socialization that came in unconsciously was like, be useful, be productive, get something done. So it occurred to me, it's like, wait a minute, I'm having a massage. Why am I ready for her to hurry up? What is it that I think I need to do other than be here? So those kinds of things have allowed me to slow down and be still more often and see what emerges from stillness. The other thing that happens is sometimes, my gut just gets jerked, and I find myself like I say sometimes in a moral breach. It was January 2017. I was my husband and I were sitting in a restaurant, probably at a bar, eating deviled eggs or whatever, and whatever we were doing. And there was a huge screen above us. And the person who'd been elected president had gone back to Florida for the first time. And there were parades of people in the street, and they were welcoming the president. We love you. And I happened to glance up. No more than 5 seconds. And you think about all of the ways that I sort of pulled myself from my own moral anchors at the time. I saw a woman. She was a large-sized woman wearing yoga pants, and she had a big sign and a big red hat on with a big bushy ponytail coming out of that hat. And she was waving her sign and waving her hips and, oh, we love you. And in about 5 seconds, I said, look at that. And I immediately described her as a piece of organic matter. I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, oh my God, what have I just done? Miss Relational Cultural, Miss Healing Connections, Miss, the source of growth is connection. And I don't know that woman. This could be the very woman who will stand in a nursing home and bathe my mother. And I have reduced her to nothing, to a lump of organic matter without knowing anything. My nervous system got so activated by that I immediately went into a place that said, this is not how we are going to move forward. This is not who I want to be. And what do we do about that? That is how I got started with the book that I published in 2019, is realizing that we have gotten so good. I've gotten so good. I'm not different from the rest of the world. I've gotten so good at just, adapting to sickness, getting along and not being real, not allowing, whatever is real to come up and then work with it. Work with it. I'm not upset that I had that impulse and that I ended up with that thought. But what would be wrong, what would not have worked for me, what would have been to ignore it, and how that landed in my gut, how wrong it felt. And then I needed to take the time to work with it. Writing comes out of working with stuff like that. It can be stuff that stinks, stuff that I don't like at all. But if it's in my body, if it's pulling at me, then that it's time for me to really work. And I found that words help me. I realized that as I was thinking about, I was getting excited about talking to you this morning, and I realized my mother was a writer, and she would write. She loved the Bible, and so whenever there was a program at her church or whatever, or somebody else's faith gathering or something, she would find things that she'd write about in the Bible, and she just called them essays or papers, and have them read in these programs. And I thought, my God, she was a writer. And she never would have been credited as a writer, but she was my first writer.
Beautiful, beautiful. So many things I can pull through out what you are saying. Unfortunately, we are at the end of this, but I want to, it's two things, the beauty of what you're saying about your mother. And as I was saying before, I'm getting that from my mother as well. I thought the writer in me came from watching my dad read, and, he fed us books early on, when he came to live in the United States and we were in the Dominican Republic. The first gift he sent us was a set of encyclopedias. So I thought that's where the writer in me came. But the more I pay attention to my mother, the more I see the writer in her, and how, metaphors, she's always using them. So that resonates with me. But the other thing, I remember, I think it was 2007, I was working at a community clinic, and we had a quite inexperienced supervisor who really was not prepared to do the work. And all of us who were supervised by her were people of color. And of course, there was a lot of anxiety, a lot of discomfort. And by then I had trained in RCT. and I was very aware of the relational aggression and kind of tracking it. And one day my colleagues did something, and it was, I think they had purchased a poster, I forget from where, but they purchased a poster of these Black and brown kids, like standing like this and saying, "You're not going to hurt me," or something like that.
Yes, yes.
And they put the poster on the supervisor's door. So when she came to work, that was the first thing she saw. And this was a very, really talking, this is horrible, but the helplessness, the white fragility was there, right? But what hit me though, because she started crying, and she went home and had to take the day off. And what hit me that day was, I don't want to be part of this. This is practicing relational aggression. As brown and Black people, we're practicing it. I don't want to be part of that. So I think, I would love for us to have another conversation on how aware we have to be of not using the same oppressive instruments, right? That had kept us down, as Audre Lorde already said for us, right?
The master's tools.
Yes,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Like we
yes.
have to be so aware, because there could be such thing as us using relational aggression in a way that hurts us more than it saves us, it protects us.
Right. When we respond out of activation, when we respond out of unmetabolized hurt and pain, we have somehow almost acquiesced to other people's language. So much of this, like what a word is worth. How do where are our medicine words? And again, our ancestors knew them because they survived, didn't they?
Yes, exactly.
Mindfulness is not new.
No. No. And I think just to close, but one of the books that I feel most grateful for these days is Mindfulness of Race by Ruth Keen, because she goes into these things as well. So again, you have an open invitation to come back and continue this, but thank you so much for giving me the first part of your Sunday to grapple with this idea. Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you. And again, it's an absolute pleasure.
Great. Thank you for listening to What a Word is Worth. You can access our episodes at Anchor and YouTube. And if you are interested, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app. And also, if you find this program beneficial, leave us a review. I am with you in love and compassion always.